coming back to developments in the conflict in Ukraine. And obviously, the recent weeks have provided a lot of quite rapid and brutal developments since the quite catastrophic meeting in the White House on February 28. There have been daily announcements about radical changes in US posture, including the suspension of committed military assistance to Ukraine, but also cuts in providing intelligence to the Ukrainian military. This raises a lot of questions about not only the US intentions, but more immediately about the immediate implications for Ukraine and the ability of its European partners to cope with this new situation. To discuss these issues, I'm joined by actual and former colleagues of ECFR, Jana Kobzova, who is a visiting fellow with the Wider Europe program, Leonid Litra, a policy fellow with the New Europe Center in Kyiv, but also a visiting fellow with ECFR. And coming back to ECFR discussions, Gustav Gressel, a former senior policy fellow at ECFR and now senior lecturer at the Austrian National Defense Academy. Maybe just to kick off the discussion, Gustav, could you tell us where things stand on the front line and how the military situation looks like for Ukraine now?
Thanks a lot. Well, actually, the military situation for Ukraine as we speak looks not so bad. First of all, if we compare the current situation with the past situation in the respective spring, so if we see the spring of 2023, we had basically the bitter phase of the battle for Bakhmut. We had extensive Russian fortifications. And Ukrainians were at the time really hard pressed. If we had the spring of 2024, we had the first session of American military deliveries because of the fight in Congress, a shell hunger period that cost tremendous amount of casualties in the Ukrainian ranks. We had the bitter phase for the battle of Avdiivka, basically, where the fall was imminent, and the question was how much will it cost? So compared to that, actually, Ukraine is doing pretty fine right now. We see actually some tactical counterattacks. This is first in the north, basically north of Kupiansk. The Ukrainians try to remove the Russian bridgeheads from the Oskil River. And we see that also in the south, in Toretsk, and in the west of Pokrovsk, where basically Ukrainians try to regain favorable defensive positions, because they, of course, know that the next spring offensive from the Russian side is going to come. And if you deny them bridgeheads, if you deny them a good defensive grounds, you basically prepare yourself for a battering the next wave of offensive. Why is Ukraine suddenly in a position to handle the Russians far better than in the past? Well, one of the reasons is the much improved situation in terms of supply in ammunition, particularly artillery ammunition. While on the Russian side, especially the degradation of gun artillery, their barrels are shot out. They don't have so many operational systems. They have a huge clock in broken systems and maintenance. Is reducing Russian artillery fire, while Ukrainian artillery fire now has probably a heyday. The other element is a progress in Ukrainian electronic warfare, particularly targeting the Russian Air Force and diminishing its effectiveness in throwing glide bombs at Ukrainian front line. That has also undercut the kind of substitution programs that the Russians had for their bad artillery, that is throwing more glide bombs. The Russians still throw quite a lot, but they don't hit that much. That is, of course, a big advantage. However, I have to say it is probably a temporary advantage because the Russians, for certain, will try to technically adjust to Ukrainian electronic warfare, and there will be a next round where things will start to get a bit worse again. Then, of course, we have General Trabati, who is very high regarded, and he was appointed to the operative strategic group Hortitia, which is basically the front or army group size command that handles most of the active parts of the front line. He is a very highly regarded general. He also induced a lot of trust, although problems with Ukrainians' command and control structure still persist. Kind of if you have a commander at the top you trust, the level of morale and the level of confidence of Ukrainian field commanders has actually increased, and that's also something that has boosted morale. Generally, basically, Ukrainian command and control structure is undergoing reform and reorganization, and they are about to tackle one of sort of some of their key shortfalls in this. But of course, we need to be cautious and wait for this reform to be executed and its results, because this is not something that will change over the weekend. That said, of course, the next Russian spring offensive is going to happen. We basically knew that Russian are again rotating troops. Their formations that headed the winter offensive are exhausted and battered. They suffered enormously heavy losses, but we also know that the Russians are reforming some of their troops and recreating them with fresh recruits, and of course the next offensive will probably happen soon, and this offensive, unfortunately for Ukraine, will happen under more constraints because of the cession of American intelligence. It is really hard for Ukrainians to watch Russian troop movements beyond the range of Ukrainian drones. And Ukrainian drones do not usually penetrate all that deep into the Russian glacis, so whatever happens behind the front is hard to detect. It is much harder for Ukrainians now to detect Russian artillery positions, staging areas, assembly areas for Russian reserves, location of command posts of the Russian army, and as well as detecting firing positions for Russian heavy weapon systems like air defense systems, like tactical ballistical missiles, etc. That will certainly impede the efficiency and effectiveness of Ukrainian defensive in the next offensive. So we are looking at a hard time. Also, that said, that adapting, for example, to European intelligence, which is not as good as American, but even technically adapting to it takes some time, because if you sort of classified intelligence is not exchanged on an open tablet, and you need to sort of arrange your structures and your technical hardware and software to receive a different set of data. And even for French supplied or British supplied weapons, most of the targeting data, the intelligence on which mission planning was resting on, basically came from the US. So here we have a huge adaptation process that is ongoing, that will hamper, of course, Ukrainian defensive efforts for some time, and we don't know how long that time is. So yeah, we're doing good, but we are looking at a very, very, very insecure future, and on that, I think I will pass on my first introductory remarks to you.
Thank you very much, Gustav. Leo, let me turn to you. What are the main challenges for the Ukrainian military of these US decisions about suspending military assistance, but also cutting intelligence sharing?
Thank you, Marie. Good morning, everyone. I think we are trying now to assemble a kind of a vision of what does it mean in terms of practical repercussions for the front line. I would say from the very beginning that every significant change in terms of support from the US usually leads to something big. Just let me remind you about the first half of 2024 when Ukraine was left without US assistance, and that resulted in Russia taking over the initiative on the front line. So this has a very clear-cut, cause effect link between what happened and what happened with the support of the US and which were the consequences for the front line. So I think we are now heading to the same kind of repercussion, to the same consequence, that this will have a consequence on the Ukrainian initiative. Well, Ukrainian doesn't hold the initiative now on the front line. However, if you look at the data from December to nowadays, you would see that the amount of territory which was seized by the Russians significantly decreased. So Ukraine is close to a real deadlock. I mean, in terms of, not having gains, but also not letting Russians to have gains. And this is real important balance. And I think that one of the kind of, widely speaking, the consequence would be that this balance could be changing to the disadvantage of Ukraine because of the US decision. So this is the most important in terms of how this impacts. Now we have a range of technical issues, I would say, well, technical issues on the front line, which are impacted by the US decision. But before going to this, I'd like to maybe underline the second big point about political military consequences for this, is that there is increasing distrust in the process led by the US. I see some kind of polite still frictions between European countries and US on this, because many of the data which were provided by the US, although US being the main kind of shareholder, but were coming from Five Eyes countries, and some of we still have some of the European countries which are providing some of the data, but of course this would be really impacted. So in terms of impact in a more tactical level, we will have real big issues with applying or using HIMARS, for instance, or even the UK made Storm Shadows, because they were using the US system of target acquisition and so on. HIMARS used to have a problem, I have to say, even before the US stopped the intelligence sharing, because the Russians have been quite good at jamming HIMARS, and their kind of reliability decreased for the last couple of months. At the same time, I'm told that we hear that not all the data were stopped, but some of the data which are concerned with the defensive operations, especially using of the air defense when it comes to missile strikes from the side of Russia, are still available for Ukraine, so they can defend. Nevertheless, pardon, the problem is that Ukraine will have reduced capabilities for its own target acquisition strikes on the Russian territory, in the occupied territories. Although I have to say that this is not like kind of 100%, because Ukraine still has some, Ukraine operates some drones with laser designators. So this is the system which is kind of giving the coordinates and shows the exact place where the strike should happen. So Ukraine is having some baby steps, I would say, in this regard. It's not that much deep into the long-range capabilities, but for the front line, this would be still kind of covering a big part of the needs that Ukraine has. So now, whether we can think about this in the long term, of course, this would make Ukraine create new capabilities and maybe put in motion a more coordinated approach from the European countries that can do intelligence sharing with Ukraine to compensate, although I don't see opportunities to compensate all of the data which is missing now. But on the short term, coming to from what I started, is going to impact, unfortunately, the Ukrainians' chances to keep this balance and take over the initiative from Russia.
Thank you very much, Leo. Something I should have said at the very beginning, but as usual, I forgot. If the audience has questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to ask your questions, and I will make sure to get answers by our speakers. Jana, these decisions by the US have come also as a shock for most, if not all Europeans. I would argue probably all Europeans. How do you assess their reaction so far? There was this extraordinary European Council yesterday with very important decisions on European defense. How do you make sense of these first reactions?
Be a bit darker than my colleagues, and maybe the view from my window will compensate the darkness. I think we're in a situation that's a completely different context for Ukraine, and the shift is much bigger than just an issue of whether the military intelligence is going to impact Ukraine's ability to defend. Since Munich, Europe has been in a stage of double awakening when it comes to the United States. Its position on Ukraine, it's basically shifted from backer to a broker. Different position, and for now, Washington seems to think that that Ukraine is more of an obstacle to a potential deal than Russia, which of course has its consequences. And the other one is the European awakening on the relationship the US has, or Trump administration has, with Europe itself. Not just when it comes to cooperation. I mean, it's famous that Trump sees the EU to deal with Europeans bilaterally, but also when it comes to defense. You know, his latest remarks about whether he will or not defend NATO countries in case of an attack, conditioning that by spending, is something we have heard during his first term as well, and it might seem as a means to pressure the NATO members and allies to spend more on their own defense. But it's also a message to our opponents. And that's kind of prompting that bigger awakening among the Europeans. The question, of course, is how quickly we can do that, both on Ukraine and on our own ability to defend ourselves in the absence of I'm going to use the phrase that was very famous during Biden era, ironclad guarantees by the US, which do not longer seem to be as ironclad as everybody had thought. And this has implications. You've asked about defense, and this is something where the Europeans are finally moving forward. But frankly, we are doing things we should have been doing 3 or 2 years ago. The announcement from last evening's councils about relaxing the fiscal rules of the European Union to allow. I would argue that for the future of European defense, 2 other speeches. President Macron's speech about the potential of nuclear sharing of nuclear deterrence with European allies. And the other one is the future Chancellor of Germany's speech and the agreement with their future coalition partner, the Social Democrats, on relaxing Germany's debt brake to allow greater investment into Germany's own defense. that should unlock billions and hundreds of billions of dollars or euros in defense. The question I would have, and this is where I think Gustav can help us a lot in terms of thinking how feasible that is, how quickly we can do that, both for ourselves, but also for Ukraine. I mean, we have seen over the 3 years that our procedures, our procurement, the way we do things is just not to catch up with the needs we have. That's especially true when it comes to our defense industries. You know, it took us sometimes, some of the member states, it took them 2 or 3 years to just upgrade the production lines. So it's not even a question of how do we replace some of the capabilities, how fast we can do that and how much of that we can deliver to Ukraine in time. Now, on Ukraine itself, as I mentioned, because of the decision in DC to has been made very clear by President Zelenskyy over the past few weeks. President Macron's and Keir Starmer from the UK have led the thinking on how to situation in Ukraine in case a deal is reached. Goes back to the idea of a deterrent force positioned inside Ukraine once a ceasefire is many would have, is that most of the Europeans seem to be open to the idea, not just member states of the EU, but also NATO, with the UK coming in as well. The question is whether we would be able to do that without the US backstop. And that is something which, based on conversations I'm having, is clear. So the key decision or the key issue is frankly how we could plan for such a force is if it's reached. So US support. I can also talk about what the Europeans can do more, but
Yeah, Jana, I think some of our listeners have noticed that we have a technical issue with you. We've been trying to settle it for like 15 minutes before the start of the webinar, but obviously it's still not completely solved because you're cutting off in almost every sentence. So maybe while we are trying to hopefully solve this issue, just as a reminder for those who have questions, please use the Q&A box, and I will turn again to Leo, and then go back to Jana. But Leo, President Zelenskyy has been trying over the past days to mend the relationship with the US, and we hear that there should be a meeting in Saudi Arabia next week. What are the key elements of US support that Ukraine is hoping to keep, and for how long, given Washington's posture on negotiations with Russia?
Well, I don't know actually, because the officials in Ukraine did not disclose their kind of, strategy. But I think that, first of all, besides, despite the fact that there is a kind of more constructive dialogue with the US in the last couple of days, I think that the Ukraine's relations with the US are quite difficult. And these are difficult because Ukraine wants to have a vision from the ceasefire to the end of the war. And what we hear from the US is that we need a ceasefire and then discuss everything else, which is, of course, in a way alarming for Ukraine, because we don't know. I mean, we had ceasefires before. I mean, this was said by President Macron, by a lot of people, including emphasized by Zelenskyy. We had 20 ceasefires, of which all of them were breached by Russia. And the last ceasefire, which was signed agreed between Zelenskyy and Putin himself in Paris at the Normandy meeting, was also breached. So that's why Ukraine is so reluctant. I mean, it's not reluctant. It's willing to get this ceasefire, but it's kind of unclear how this unfolds in the future. I see that the US would like to put Ukrainians at the table with Russians on Tuesday. Although so far there have been reports that it's going to be only Ukraine-US kind of talks about what can be done. But I see also, I think there will be an attempt also to put Ukrainians with, to talk with Russians. I have the feeling that from what the Russian representatives have been told publicly, that this would be kind of a start from Istanbul, format grievances to Ukraine. I think Ukraine will have quite opposite grievances, but I mean, I really regret that at this discussion, EU is not going to be there, as far as I know. Now, what Ukraine trying to answer you see in this, I tried to give a bit of context. In this context, I think that Ukrainians are willing, and they still think that the US will be returning to intelligence sharing and continuing support, which was on the way to Ukraine. But I think that Ukrainians try to act in a way that if this doesn't happen, then our plans are still in a way, in place. Because we understand from the last couple of weeks, I guess this would be the correct term, but we cannot rely. I mean, what was yesterday is no more longer kind of, still relevant today. And this is kind of the system which has been in place, and it's pardon, it's challenging. And I don't know whether US would find what they do feasible also. I mean, so far, Trump is very much kind of, he thinks of himself that he is very correct in, approaching the settlement in this way. Ukrainian society reacts different. It's not only the leadership. We see today in the morning, it was published, the latest poll, by the way. So Ukraine has 68%, Zelenskyy has 68% approval. He didn't have such approval since January 2024. So before the Russians took over the initiative on the front line. This is like really, really high. I mean, for a country which has so many problems and for a leader which has so many issues. I mean, therefore, I think that the only way we can get from the US, I mean, we can continue relying on the US, is that to show to the US that we have alternatives. This is very important. And we have alternatives if EU is on board with us.
Thank you, Leo. Let me turn back to you, Jana, and hope that it works better than last time. Leo just emphasized one point we've often discussed with you, the growing disconnect between US and Ukrainian perceptions of the conflicts. I would imagine that there are also some divergences within the EU on how various European countries, more than EU, perceive the way forward, and whether some countries are willing to go along with ambitious plans like the boots on the ground, or whether some of them would like to prioritize keeping the US on board over potentially defending Ukraine. So how do you expect this growing disconnect to have effects, and how do you expect Europeans to act moving forward?
Thank you. I have switched off the video, so hopefully the connection is going to be better. I think, when we discuss the disconnect between how Kyiv perceives the end goal and the US perceives the end goal of this, that has been the case for the past few weeks. And that's why they had such a big disagreement. And the meeting in DC was a confirmation of that. But I think there has been a readjustment on the side of Ukraine, where, as I said, they understood that the US is no longer their backer. They're trying to be a broker, which is a very different role. That's first. And second, if you go back 7 months ago, President Zelenskyy introduced his victory plan, which was basically a plan for Ukraine's almost total victory. There is an adjustment in Kyiv now, where the understanding is that rather than opposing and explaining why Russia is not a reliable partner, as not just the Ukrainians see, but also, as you outlined, President Macron and others who have been involved in these negotiations for over years, trying to go ahead, but formulate its own red lines on what needs to happen or what needs to take place for this idea of a ceasefire to halt. And this is where I see the biggest disagreement for now, between what the Ukrainians and a number of European countries led by President Macron and others see that ceasefire is not going to hold if it's just on paper. There needs to be some sort of an enforcement, deterrent force on the ground, not just to deter future Russian attacks, but also to maintain stability within Ukraine. If you have a ceasefire that has no guarantees, I think a lot of people would be asking questions about how the deal is good for Ukraine. Why is it keeping Ukraine open to another Russian attack? And I think a lot of people and groups would contest that kind of a deal, which would make it very difficult for President Zelenskyy or anyone else to accept it in the first place. So that force is both a reassurance measure to the Ukrainians and a message to the Russians. Where, as you said, the views continue to differ is whether the European, not the EU, but broader European member states and NATO allies can deploy such force without the US backing. And this is a fundamental issue because number of member states, even those who are willing to help, even those who are supporting Ukraine for day one, are concerned that if there is no US backstop, that force will be tested by the Russians. And agreeing on the rules of engagement, on a response, and what would that do to the eastern flank? It's not like we have unlimited supplies of soldiers we can just move around. If we move some of them, and our colleague Camille Grant has written about the need for 20,000 strong force, which effectively means 60,000 given the rotation of these units, those soldiers would be moved from somewhere else, including the eastern flank. So number of countries who are completely supportive of Ukraine will have to make hard choices about trusting the ceasefire and trusting the support of other allies with whom they would deploy to Ukraine, that this is not going to weaken their own security. So I wonder if, frankly, the hardest discussions on these issues are still ahead of us. It's one thing to outline what the mission is going to look like, but, the rules of operation, how that's going to work, are still a work in progress, and they will remain so in the next few weeks at least.
Thank you, Jana, and I confirm it works better without the video. One last question to you, Gustav, before we move to the Q&A session. In case the US withdrawal is confirmed, which capacities will Europeans need to provide in order to continue helping Ukraine to resist? And can they cope with that?
Not to the qualitative and quantitative extent that the Americans did before. So one of the big problems, of course, is intelligence, ISR, and it's not the kind of strategic level intelligence. Here, still, I think the Brits have a very good overview and can provide bilateral information, not the stuff they get from the Americans on Five Eyes. And they're sovereign on the sort of what they themselves gather. This is not subjected to American restrictions. The problem is kind of operative tactic intelligence. Here, especially American electronic intelligence, satellite-based electronic intelligence on Russian position and movements. Here we have huge gaps. We can provide Ukraine with some improvised stuff. It will need a bit of time to teeter that in, but we basically have to see how it works. Again, even the French and the British, with what they delivered in weapons, rested these weapon systems rested their effectiveness on being supplied by American intelligence on where the Russians are, with what kind of air defense systems, with what kind of dispositions, etc. So it's untested ground, and it's really hard to make predictions. The other big problem, of course, is air defense. Ukraine needs a continuation of its air defense effort. The Russians are increasing production. The North Koreans are increasing productions, and you know, we see the intensity of Russian attacks basically increasing by the day. And Ukraine's defense sector is a huge part of Ukraine's ability to actually resist the Russians. Because Europe and the Americans have been painfully slow in increasing production of their own ammunition field. Basically, Ukraine tried to improvise and jumped in, and it did so remarkably successful, one has to say. But of course, it only matters if it can be protected by means from the air. And here we have two problems. The first is, of course, Patriot interceptors. They are key to protect against ballistic missile attacks. If we see Americans closing down Maxar, I think even the possibility of Europeans buying Patriots for Ukraine is a very doubtful proposition. I don't think the Americans will go forward with that. So in that case, we have to think, okay, so what can we provide? The other system that is available is the French, Italian, British Aster 30. So SAMPT is the land-based version of this. But the problem is we don't produce the ammunition at scale to really bring Ukraine through the defensive effort. We can try to pressure America into allowing us to deliver. That would, for example, necessitate for example, European threatening to cancel F-35 and Patriots orders in the US if the US don't do that. There's no chance in convincing Trump. We can only, I think Kellogg gave us a very good strategy advice on how to deal with America. That is whacking the mule. And we need to think of options to whack the American mule. And that is not what is in sort of the political tradition of Europeans, but we have to develop it fast. On other things, we have the capability to continue support Ukraine. We have a now pretty robust artillery ammunition production. We have on other sensors, we have increased production. Armored vehicles will be a tricky thing, but with a concentrated effort, we can at least increase that. I have to say, by Ukrainians having now a much better chain of supplies for locally produced spare parts, for cooperation with Western defense industry and servicing and maintaining Western delivered vehicles, the readiness state and the recovery time from damaging to reissuing to the front has been shortened considerably. So we are in a much better situation than we have been 1 year ago. Nevertheless, it will be taunting. Now, for Europeans, and I want to underline what Jana said, that Trump's presence in NATO is not credible, and it is not credible. The problem is European armies not only are in peacetime mode, they also are in an organizational and doctrinal state that requires them to fight with the Americans. We are heavily reliant on air superiority. We are heavily reliant on American ISR in the way how we fight, our armies would fight. With America being not an ally anymore, that not only needs to change in terms of we need to have sovereign fighters, sovereign munition, our own stuff, but we also need to organizationally and structurally adjust to fight without the Americans, because we won't be able to fight the American way of fighting without them. And these organizational doctrinal training changes will need time to materialize. It's not only putting money on the table. We have a lot of adjustments to do now in Europe, not only in technology, not only in armament, not only in procurement, etc. And the only way Russia will not exploit this weakness, where we don't have America as an ally, but still don't have the capability to defend ourselves, is to make them be bothered in Ukraine. So Ukrainian is now fighting for us to get the chance to rearm. And on this note, you know, continue to supplying Ukraine. It's not a charity. It's our vital strategic interest. If you fail in that, the next war is on us, and it will come sooner than we expect.
Thank you, Gustav. I will now move to the Q&A section. We have a lot of questions, so I will try to group them. We have questions about the situation on the ground. How is the situation in Kursk, and would Ukraine be forced to abandon it and lose a key bargaining chip in a future negotiation? We have another series of questions regarding the extent to which American assistance has been reduced. Is cooperation a military and intelligence problem, or does it go as much broader and deeper as, for instance, cutting down USAID and other help programs? And does the cut in intelligence sharing by the US also affect the UK sharing intelligence? And what about the Starlink services? Is it continued or interrupted, or temporarily continued, but with the possibility of interrupting it? There are a number of questions on the announcements regarding European defense, whether the Rearm Europe defense spending proposal with its EU spending waivers is realistically able to ramp up European military support to Ukraine in the short term. Also, the risks of obstructionism from Hungary and Slovakia slowing or stopping the EU's ability to further ramp up aid, and whether we should also look at what is moving in the right direction and see the glass half full instead of half empty. So a lot of also positive announcements from the side of European countries. I'll stop here for this round of questions. We have many more, but I think for now it's enough. Maybe Gustav, you go first.
Okay, with Kursk, so the Russians are now trying to advance to cut off the main supply line to Kursk. So they are advancing, sort of trying to attack across the Ukrainian-Russian border in the kind of southwest of the Kursk salient. They haven't made progress on the ground, but this road is within range of Russian drones, and especially Russian fiber optic drones, which are harder to jam. And they're increasingly taking out Ukrainian supplies on the way to Kursk. So, and that is a dangerous situation. The key question about Kursk is how imminent and how realistic are negotiations with Russia? I mean, now is of course the time where Kursk matters because it's a bargaining chip vis-a-vis Russia. But if you look at the Russian position, they demand, as a precondition for even starting to ceasefire, not only for Ukraine to give up Kursk, but also to give up what they call new territories, so what they have annexed on paper, as a precondition. Before that, there won't be even talks about ceasefire. That doesn't mean that there will be ceasefire. And the Americans are backing this demand. That also needs to be clearly said. America is backing the Russian demands on this. So in that context, you of course need to have a debate whether Kursk is still worth it, whether the diversion of forces on the Ukrainian side versus the diversion of forces on the Russian side is still worth, if this needs to continue over months. It was, to my point, worth for a long time because the Ukrainians encouraged at the right territory, which is easy to defend, and they have inflict high damages on the Russians because they kind of grabbed the right land to do this kind of sting. But the problem is, if the logistical lifelines come under strain, then this is going to look problematic, to say the least. And then Ukrainians will have to make a decision based on the military realities. Personally, I'm completely unconvinced that the American initiative will lead to anything, either ceasefire or peace or whatever. I do not see this this war to end. The Russians are super confident that it will win the war, that it will militarily decide it. They are super cocky right now, and as said, the Russians have American backing on this, which makes their a necessity to compromise basically non-existent, especially in their own mindset, which is America focused.
Thank you. Leo, maybe also on the extent of cuts in US assistance.
So, which question do you want me to answer?
The question regarding whether the cuts in US assistance is only a military problem or is deeper and also affects US aid, and also whether this affects the intelligence sharing is limited for the UK, and what we may know about possible interruption of Starlink services.
Well, I think this is more wider. I mean, we've seen the kind of the ambush in the White House. We've seen it's part of a bigger kind of trend which is happening, and I think the trend was there before the cuts. I mean, it was there before the cuts. We felt it, and we felt it in the messages. I mean, Trump administration adopted pretty much all the Russian narratives about the war in Ukraine. Zelenskyy is a dictator. You have no cards, you have no whatever. I mean, you remember all this. So I think this is a wider problem, a wider trend. I guess we can stop this trend if during the negotiations or pre-negotiations, Ukraine would be more constructive than Russia, maybe. I mean, and this can work only if, as Susan Stewart wrote about the broker in the comments, only if the broker is a real broker, but is not siding with Russia. So far, we've seen that the US is kind of using the Russian narratives in approaching Ukraine, and this is a big problem for us. So if the broker is real, then I guess in the pre-negotiations, the trend of attacking someone should move towards Russia, because as Gustav mentioned, the Russian initial positions before discussing anything is that Ukraine should withdraw from the 4 regions, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, and officially acknowledge that these territories belong to Russia, which you understand this is not going to happen. I mean, in any case, even if you interrupt everything, you cut the internet to Ukraine, I mean, this is not going to happen, because Zelenskyy is going to be kind of overturned by its own people if he ever thinks even of agreeing on this. Now, on the technical side with Starlinks, I mean, we had 1 week ago or so reassurances from Elon Musk that this is not going to happen. I don't trust these reassurances, because we had many more reassurances before which didn't work in the end. So I think the fact that Ukraine is looking at Eutelsat or other options as a kind of alternative for using these terminals is a good thing. And by the way, I also think that precisely because there is an alternative, the cut from Starlink is less likely to happen, because it doesn't change anything. I mean, you don't get anything. And if Ukraine would have also an alternative, a solid alternative on some other issues, like intelligence, then the intelligence cutting would be largely a symbolic kind of step. So the biggest problem is now that we have this complete reliance on US air defense. This is like the most serious, I would say, which is going to affect Ukraine. And you already seen, I mean, today we have 53% rate of missile shutting down this morning, which used to be much higher. It used to be 67, I mean, for the last months.
Thank you. Jana, over to you for the questions on European defense, whether the plans announced will be able to ramp up European military support quickly enough, and whether Hungary or Slovakia may play a role in slowing or stopping the EU's plans on this.
Thank you. I would add two more quick questions on something else. One on aid that has been stopped for Ukraine. You know, the EU, the United States, including USAID, has been one of the biggest funders of protection of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, for example. So this is not just about military intelligence or data sharing. This is about real work that is ongoing to shield or protect Ukraine's energy infrastructure from Russian attacks. USAID has been vital in supporting Ukraine's civil society, USAID and free media. USAID has been very vital in supporting anti-corruption reform. And some of it might be restarted, or that's at least the thinking. I'm not sure. But you know, this goes beyond just the military, and it's serious. It's serious. It's felt across different sectors. And this is an area, an issue that the EU is looking at in terms of what we can compensate. But this is not going to happen quickly, and it's not going to happen fully. That's first. Second, yes, indeed, US is a broker. That doesn't mean it's a neutral broker. And the latest confirmation of that is that whilst the US has stopped military sharing, intelligence sharing to the Ukrainians, it has done nothing to stop the Russian attacks on Ukraine. There's been another attack today. We see no response from the United States in terms of pressuring the Russians into stopping that and showing a willingness for a ceasefire, which President Trump so desires, demonstrate that this is indeed something. So we have seen a lot of pressure on Ukraine, no pressure on Russia. I don't expect this to change. I think, you know, the view in Washington, D.C. is very clear. And to your point about divisions within the European Union, I think we have seen last night or yesterday how this is going to play out. I think you have one member state that is fully aligned with the United States, which is Hungary, and that is not going to change. And so other member states will need to find a way around it, whether it's issuing a separate statement or just doing things in outside of the EU mechanisms. With Slovakia, I think Prime Minister Fico's words have to, as problematic as they are, on a number of occasions, have to be taken with a pinch of salt. Some of it is for domestic audiences, and as he has seen yesterday, Slovakia has, in his mind, one interest, and that is renewal of the gas transit, even through Ukraine, of the Russian gas. Even that has not been something the EU has supported, and yet Slovakia consented to the conclusions. So I think Hungary is going to be much more of a challenge in terms of blocking decisions. But the EU has been especially over the past few weeks, Europeans, including the Brits, have been very creative about finding means of getting around that. And I think this is going to be the way forward. When it comes to whether we can compensate defense in the long term, if we are serious, absolutely. But that's going to take so much more time, which Ukraine doesn't have at the moment. You know, we can, in the next few months, we can continue supplying some of the stuff we have in our storages or what we are actually using and shipping it to Ukraine. But here I would actually call on Gustav's expertise. I think the moves that we have made over the past few days are very important, but I maintain they should have been made 3 years ago.
Gustav, do you want to add something on this, or we move to the second round of questions?
Well, short on the UK issue, the UK can deliver intelligent products that were created by UK sovereign intelligence and are not do not contain stuff that is provided by the Americans through Five Eyes. The problem is Five Eyes is so intermeshed with UK intelligence products that the agencies have a real difficulty in practically separating the two things. That will take a bit of time, but it is, of course, something that is possible. But it's clear, everything that came through America can't even be passed on. Now, on European defense, there are short-term way around to some American capabilities. The problem is air defense is one of the most crucial things where building up production capabilities is demanding and will not come in the right time. The second thing is for basically European sovereign defense. We are looking into so many issues where we have been, and not only in defense products, trusting on the Americans would be in NATO. This is really a long-term endeavor. And basically can only be achieved if the Russians are not victorious in Ukraine. If the Russians are victorious in Ukraine and they turn this army that they have right now onto us live, we have and the Americans are the Americans that are today, we have a gigantic problem. And yeah, there is no easy answer to it because a lot of things, as I said, are untried with regard to Ukrainians, and the same is with, if you look at plans, look back at the ammunition initiative, it was the right thing to do, but it needed much more time, and we stumbled across much more obstacles along the way of increasing artillery ammunition production than we thought we would, and that's why it was delayed. It's now in place and it's now ready. If we had switched to a increased defense industrial output with the aim of facilitating Ukrainian victories, so the policies that all the Kaliber-Experten were talking about in Germany, then of course now we would be in a position to supplement the Americans and substitute them. But we haven't done that. It was a conscious decision not to do so because most Europeans shared the strategic aim of the Biden administration to kind of not allow a Ukrainian victory, but just prevent a Ukrainian defeat and do the minimum effort that was necessary to achieve that under the condition of broad US leadership. Yeah, and now that's by far not enough.
Thanks, Gustav. Leo, you had a two fingers.
Really short, thank you. Well, I mean, you may read in Gustav's policy brief from late last year on the European defense possibilities, and I think that most of his recommendations are still valid because on some of the issues, not many things happened. But I wanted to add on what Jana mentioned as well on the European capacity. We have a sort of, how to say, a mental issue, a psychological kind of disadvantage that we think we can do less than we are able to do. Russians are portraying themselves that they are more powerful than they are, and we know that it's not the case. I mean, they say that without US, Ukraine would be done in 3 days, but without North Korea, Russia would be in much worse position because they have 50% of their ammunition coming from North Korea. They have Kyiv-23 ballistic missiles, which are firing to Kyiv and some other regions. They have North Korea soldiers, they have Iran drones, they have China, machinery working for the Russian. So they have like real reliance on the outside. It's not like this. While in Europe, we have the impression that Europe is less powerful than actually it is. I mean, if you look at all the numbers, Europe is by far overriding Russia in, 10 times, 12 times in all of the areas. So the potential is there. We're missing some kind of, character in terms of adopting some of the decisions. And the more we delay adopting this, the more is going to be difficult, because what you adopt now is going to happen in 6 months, 12 months, so we have to be forward looking.
Thank you. Let's move to the second round of questions. Again, there are very different questions. I'll try to group as much as possible, but it's not always possible. So there are questions on some of the proposals that have been voiced in Europe. For example, the French proposal that has been, by the way, taken over by Zelenskyy, of a partial 1-month ceasefire. What would be Russia's incentive to accept that, and what are the leverages that Europe can rely on, given that US is still quite lukewarm on it. Also a question on the idea of boots on the ground, given Russia's opposition to NATO troops being deployed in Ukraine. Should these proposals be taken seriously? One more question, sorry, on potential new partners to cope with some capability gaps, whether the Israeli Iron Dome type of missile defense shield could be one alternative, and whether Israel could look at helping Ukraine more actively with its components, radars, etc., not dependent on the US Patriot system. And also a number of questions on potential negotiations. So we had one on the US neutrality as a broker that some of you already answered, but a question on if Trump really wants to broker a ceasefire, is there any chance he might at some point concede to Ukraine's request to invite Europeans at the table? Or is Trump not likely to move on this because he is not neutral in the end? And yeah, one question on European perceptions of the US and whether Biden's election in 2020 triggered the impression that we were back to normal and there would be no more lunacies in American politics, and that the American public would not go for Trump a second time. And one comment that some of you may be interested in elaborating on, the foreign aid that Ukraine receives is not only about what happens now, but it's also shaping the image that Ukrainians have of their Western partners. And so what we are doing now is also building the future of our relationships with Ukraine. So maybe some of you will want to elaborate on this. I'll go back to you. Maybe I can start with you, Jana, for a change. Is that okay?
Sure. You've asked a number of questions. I think, Leo pointed out one thing, we constantly underestimate ourselves and we are still in a reactive mode, we as the Europeans. I think, not all of this has come as a surprise. A lot of us have been talking about the need for the Europeans to develop their own plan or vision for how the war in Ukraine should end. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened, and as a result, Trump seized the initiative. But I think there is still a narrow path forward to something that would be a more sustainable solution for Ukraine and for the European own security. But that entails kind of relying more on ourselves rather than on hoping to completely change Trump's calculus. The difference is basically one of a geography. If things go badly, Trump can just withdraw, and he has an ocean between his own country and the European continent and Russia. We don't have that luxury. Ukraine doesn't have that luxury. It entails a couple of things, and famously or infamously, Trump told Zelenskyy during the Oval Office meeting that Zelenskyy has no cards. The Europeans and Ukrainians together actually have some cards to play. Some of them are related to money. The Europeans have been talking a lot about the need to be part of the negotiations when they happen, but what have they put on the table to be part of them? And there are a couple of things we can put on the table. First one is of course money. Partly we have done that with unlocking or relaxing the rules on defense spending. The other issue, which there is slowly a change of thinking in some European capitals, is about what to do with the immobilized Russian assets. It's probably not feasible to fully use them now, but the thinking is that perhaps as part of a ceasefire deal, some of those money could be used, and that would be a big change. It's something that, again, should have been happening a long time ago, but it hasn't. the other thing, which I think the Europeans can do, is actually nominate their own envoy for negotiations, a senior figure that is respected or has experience with both the Russians and Americans, and of course the Ukrainians, that could provide some sort of a unification or unifying person or a point for all these European efforts, because a lot of that is now distributed in different capitals. And then, of course, the last point is, Europe has its own framework for the future of Ukraine. That is the European accession. Yes, it's far off. It's not happening now, but this is a framework which Ukraine can and should be at one point integrated. So these are the cards Europeans can play. They need to play them smartly. They need to play them now. And those are things that should be on the table when discussing with the Ukrainians and Trump administration on how we are going to make a deal that is not just liked by Trump, but actually holds for longer than 1 month. I think, this is just a short point on Macron's idea of a 1 month long ceasefire. I think it's a good idea to seize the initiative and test Russia's willingness, because while for now there's been a pressure piling from the United States of America on Ukraine, there's been nothing like that in terms of testing Russia's own willingness to stop the fighting. So I think, we have nothing to lose by offering that and seeing if the Russians respond, while seriously preparing for the negotiations, either by helping the Ukrainian side to prepare and kind of help draw them the red lines. Leo mentioned some of them. And I think these should also be the red lines for the Europeans at large, or entering those negotiations ourselves.
Thank you, Jana. Leo, do you want to come next?
Yes, I mean, I would refer to the question on the Russian opposition to NATO members, peacekeepers. I think this initiative is very relevant and still stays. Is one of the cards actually of the of NATO EU member states, yeah, because it's not a EU NATO led potential mission, but I think that we need to start also the debate about this from refuting the arguments of Russia, because nobody asked Ukraine or other countries when Russia invited North Korea soldiers to join, or nobody asked US, Europe when they delivered nukes, tactical nukes to Belarus. I mean, this is an important thing to mention. So the peacekeepers, and I saw the skepticism about these peacekeepers in the US, and I think this is very short-sighted thinking of disconsidering this force. The problem which Jana mentioned earlier, that many countries are resistant because US is not providing its backing for potential peacekeeping mission. But I think that even if you don't have this peace backing, if you have the soldiers on the ground, that would create very big risk for Russia to jump into a war which they cannot sustain in the long term, I think. I mean, and also if this peacekeeping force would be combined with these initiatives like Sky Shield, I mean, we've seen the kind of the proposal which was made, I think is very relevant. It's addressing all the questions, all the fears of not kind of avoiding the possibility of engagement, direct military engagement with Russia, because this air force would be basically 200 kilometers away from each other, which is, I mean, not giving the possibility to engage directly. And also, I mean, when I say refuting arguments, I also say about, I mean, NATO is totally overlooked now. It's not preferred. I mean, US told it's not going to happen. Everyone had its own moment of not going to happen, and then things are changing. Let's hope so. I mean, we'll see, because Hexet was asked in Brussels. So you said no NATO for Ukraine. You say no more military aid to Ukraine, and so on. So we understood what are the concessions made by Ukraine. So what are the concessions made by Russia? I mean, which are the concessions made by Russia? And this is, I think, a lot of the questions which will be asked during the negotiations. For us, for Ukraine, in the negotiations, and maybe I'm a little bit forward-looking and not answering straight to the question, but I think I need to underline this. It's very important if we will be forced to have elections after the temporary ceasefire, and then we will have a negotiation about settlement. This sounds like a brilliant Russian-style plan, which is very dangerous because Ukraine will be destabilized and might be destroyed from within in the event of having elections under this kind of circumstances. And I really hope that if Ukraine and the EU together will play wisely by kind of spoiling this kind of initiative by making some of the inputs, like the input which Yana mentioned about 1 month, ceasefire, then we have chances to roll back this kind of issues. And can I also take the question on Iron Dome? I mean, I'm not an air defense expert. I think Gustav maybe is more entitled to give a military perspective on this. But at the level of the discussions in Ukraine, I think it's a long time ago that we are not considering this system. There are a number of reasons, especially in the type of the threat which we are facing from the side of Russia, the cost of the system, the type of the threat. I mean, we have missiles which fly, at 12,000 kilometers, the speed. Iron Dome is not able to intercept this kind of missiles. And it's very costly. It will require a lot of time to deliver it. So for us, the best would be to have a significant amount of interceptors for the Patriots and simultaneously move on something more autonomous, like Gustav mentioned, Duster 30 for CMT. The problem is the production of the interceptors, which is really deplorable because, it took 3 years to realize that we really need to produce this, So I'll stop here.
Thank you. Gustav, over to you.
I second Leo's comments on the Israelis. We see that also in the delivery of the Arrow system to Germany. The US had to grant approval because it's so full of American technology that basically it needs to be treated like an American weapon system. So Israel is of absolutely no help. And I think under the current circumstances, the Israelis will not anger the Americans. So the thing about European initiatives, yeah, they are technically feasible. We can deploy these troops. The thing is, what's at the European mind is if we deploy troops in Ukraine, which will not, I don't like the term peacekeeper because that's not what they're doing. They're basically will be part of Ukrainian defenses. There will be European brigades inserted into the newly created Ukrainian core structure. And then, I don't know, the 5th Ukrainian Corps will have a French brigade, and the 1st Ukrainian Corps will have a German brigade, and the 6th Ukrainian Corps will have a British brigade, and the 2nd Ukrainian Corps will have a mixed Dutch, Australian, whatever brigade. And they will be deployed there. They will rotate to the zero line and sort of like the enhanced forward presence in the Baltic countries or in Poland. And if Russia reattacks, then basically you would have to reckon by shooting not only at Ukrainians, but shooting at Germans and French, etc., that they will enter a wider war than an isolated conflict over Ukraine. But there's where the problem starts, because if the Russians do that, they will say, any country that steps to Ukraine, you have these troops there, but any country that considers itself at war with Russia beyond Ukraine will be nuked by tomorrow. And then, of course, everybody will look at Paris, and it's sort of the sovereign French nuclear deterrent, and ask, will the French enter into this race of nuclear blackmail against against the Russian Federation. And here's where the backdrop comes. They wanted to say, well, if a Russian attack on Europe because of security guarantees happens, we need the Americans to be on the side of NATO and invoke or come to their commitments under Article 5. That's the backdrop needed. Of course, the Americans don't give that because Trump, as basically confirmed by his yesterday remarks, is pondering about exiting NATO anyway. And even if he formally can't exit, he's basically giving Europeans a signal that the Americans, regardless what happens, will not be on their side. So we can forget about the political circumstances that Europeans wish to have. The second thing is, again, I don't think that Americans will produce anything. I think we are still not honest about what the situation is. Landsberg is compared the American-Russian negotiations with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and I think that's the only accurate description of the situation being. The Americans have folded completely to the Russian position, and we do not yet have a full picture of the Zusatzprotokolle that Americans and Russians have agreed upon. The counter service Americans expect probably is not about Europe, but about something else. And the Americans, and Kellogg basically said that yesterday, they think themselves as having overextended and just want to get rid of obligations. And they do not care about the manner or the feasibility or the fate of the people on the ground of the territories they abandon. And the Russians now see the chance to regain their full control over Ukraine and have the Americans out. And this is a situation I think a lot of Europeans have not fully realized. The Americans are completely out, and they will be of no further help either for Ukrainians or for Europeans themselves. And that is an enormously horrifying and tricky situation. And that is a situation that commands deep adaptation in the European defense, thinking in not only substituting weapon systems from the US with indigenous ones, but also rethinking an operational tactical defenses, how we organize it, how we organize our armed forces, etc. And here, I think we do not do ourselves a favor if we make up or if we waste too much time in thinking on hypotheses and how the world might happen if we convince the Americans to do this and that, because the Americans don't react to anything. If we want to slow down the American abandonment of their European commitments, we have to apply pressure. I think the Canadians are the only one who really managed to handle the Americans by starting not only to impose counter tariffs, but to cut, for example, electricity to America, to regions that cannot be supplied with sufficient electricity without Canadian energy grid. That cost Canadians a lot in terms of money, but they are making a point, and they see Trump buckling down and retreating from his previous threats because you whacked the mule, because Canadians understood to whack the American mule. Now, what Europeans need to prepare, first, Americans want to lift all sanctions on Russia. That would mean a return of American tech companies to the Russian defense market. Europeans need urgently to consider and publicly threaten sanctions on American companies that help the Russian defense sector. That needs to be flagged to Washington in order for them to know what is coming. The second thing is we need to at least reconsider our orders in American weapon systems, and we need to start bargaining some because we don't have short-term substitutions. We need to bargain with them about the right to export this to Ukraine. We need to bargain this about the right to use data on our own, the bargain to make these systems more independent to use them by our own, or threaten to just cancel orders. The American defense industry does not have a second market like the Europeans. That is something where we are clear. And the other thing is, of course, We should enter to threaten tariffs. We should enter to threaten sanctions on. We should enter to threaten regulation that would drive the US tech sector out of Europe, because that is how you whack the American mule. And without that, nothing constructive will come out of Washington, and nothing constructive will happen in this war and with regard to our own security. Which brings me back to sort of the last point. The Germans are dead serious about French nuclear deterrence. They have lost all confidence in the Americans, and I think the Americans haven't realized that gigantic shift that is going on in Europe. And the thing is, you had all these people who were the most transatlanticist that are now the most critical, because they understand who Trump is and what he does. Whether those who infrequently engage with Americans or have the least experience being an American ally still have the longest illusions on the Americans. Yes, Biden's election and the way we could manage Trump 1 gave Europeans a lot of illusions about Trump 2. But the bubble burst, the illusions are gone. The only thing is we haven't found the spine and the balls to convert our dismay and disgust with the American political actions into concrete action. But I think it will come.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of this webinar, but we have a few more minutes and 2 more questions that I hope we can answer quickly. And I would also ask the speakers to share their final 2 sentences of what the listeners should take away from this discussion. So the 2 questions are, one on domestic Ukrainian military capacities. President Zelenskyy said 30% of the military equipment used in 2024 was produced domestically. What is the potential for the Denmark model to assist enhance this production capabilities? And another question, which I think is very useful to remind all the time, whether the description of what France, Britain, and others have in mind when discussing boots on the ground, whether this should be designed as peacekeepers or rather a tripwire force. So these are the 2 last questions. And as I said, over to you for final 2 sentences and main takeaways. Maybe we start with you, Gustav, again.
So on Ukrainian domestic production, this primarily resorts to ammunition, mortar ammunition, artillery shells, small arms ammunition, drones, ammunition for drones. Drones also need explosives to be lethal. Electronic warfare systems. The increase in capabilities were really sharp, and especially the price difference. A artillery shell produced in Ukraine is roughly 1/5 of the price than an artillery shell that is produced in Europe. That is also a huge advantage, why a lot of countries support the buildup of Ukraine's defense sector, because if you compare the price difference in investing the same money in Europe, you get a lot more in Ukraine. The thing is, of course, it rests on the air defense situation. And the second thing is Ukraine have some capability gaps they yet have not addressed. The first thing is air defense. They are talking about, or there are programs to restart S-300 production in Ukraine. It was a kind of Patriot comparable missile that was produced during the Cold War in Ukraine. But until you are in sufficient numbers, this takes quite some time. And the second thing is, of course, the reconnaissance field here. Ukrainian defense industry is hampered by not having sufficient special materials and parts for electronic warfare and electronic reconnaissance that they can import, because these are sort of most of these components are restricted in export and are restricted to kind of NATO allies only. That's a huge problem. I hope, at least from the European side, we will be much more generous in this. And the third part is heavy fighting vehicles. that's still a problem. Ukrainians produce a lot of light fighting vehicles like AMRAPs, wheeled, lightly armored stuff to rotate troops on the ground. But heavy fighting vehicles are very necessary still, especially infantry fighting vehicles. And here Ukraine has still a lack of capabilities.
Leo, over to you.
Well, thank you, Gustav, for actually covering the question on domestic production. I'll only add some numbers. At the beginning of the war, it was 10% in 22. Now it's not 30, it's 40% to be precise of the domestic production from all the defense articles. The problem is indeed if you look at the categories, as Gustav mentioned, because for instance, we have in drone production, we have 96% of the drone production of all the drones used in Ukraine. And in air defense, we have 0. I mean, if you don't consider the mortars which were shooting down the Shaheds as air defense. I mean, the problem is significant. Ukraine has some initiatives aside from S-300, which Gustav mentioned. We also have the initiative of Corsair, which was almost done for the first kind of example, but as I understand, it was damaged. So there are some initiatives, but these are not possible to develop without the support of the Western partners. This bottom line is, if we have access to materials which we need to, spare parts which we need from the Western defense companies, then Ukraine will be able actually to do it by itself. But it will take anyway time. It's a matter of years, maybe. So it's very kind of serious. Also, the Danish model, this is a very well done, designed model. More countries are kind of putting their money in this model. The problem is, again, the fact that some of the companies, some of the countries, I mean, would like to, if in terms of producing something which is missing, would like to produce this after the ceasefire, after the settlement, which is problematic in terms of, you know, what we need today. So for us, we really would like to see from European countries to front load some of the support they can have for Ukraine. And in terms of the peacekeeping mission or tripwire force, well, in Ukraine we see this mission as having not being as a peacekeeping but as a deterrence mission first of all, so that it has a clear, it's heavy armed and it has a clear mandate to respond if it's attacked. I mean, this is the main reason of having such a mission. If it's only a mission, I mean, to kind of stay somewhere in Lviv region and to say that it's, you know, we are present here, this is our security guarantees, I think this is not to be very credible and convincing.
Thank you, Leo. Jana, over to you for your final remarks.
Thank you. I will be very brief because my colleagues have answered all the questions. I think the key challenge for the Europeans is to basically stop thinking about Ukraine as an isolated challenge and integrate it into its understanding of where we are as Europe and our security. And in that way, Ukraine becomes one of Europe's most important partner. There is no way if there is another Russia attack, that we would be able to defend ourselves without Ukrainian experience or capabilities. So treat assistance and support to Ukraine as an investment into our own security and shed the illusions about the United States. That doesn't mean that the scenarios that Gustav have mentioned are 100% going to happen, but we are receiving evidence almost on a daily basis that this is where we are headed to. So shedding the illusions and preparing for these scenarios is definitely much better than being surprised when they happen.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very good conclusion for our webinar. I suspect there will be more challenges to come and more occasions to discuss what Europeans should do and how they should keep calm and carry on. So we will be back. And I just wanted to thank the audience for the very good question and thank our 3 speakers for their insights. Thank you very much and see you soon.